The rain didn't care that it was supposed to be the happiest day of his life. It fell anyway, washing the color out of the stained glass and drumming against the high church roof like a ticking clock. Standing at the altar, staring down an empty aisle, Jesse felt the truth finally settle into his bones. His Alpha wasn't coming. The whispers in the pews swelled, thick with pity. Then, the heavy oak doors banged open, but the man silhouetted against the storm wasn't his cowardly fiancé. It was the city's most dangerous Alpha. The priest checked his watch. Again. It was a subtle movement, just a quick flick of the wrist beneath his heavy white vestments. But in the suffocating quiet of the cathedral, it might as well have been a gunshot. Jesse saw it. Everyone saw it. The air in the room was stale. 200 guests were crammed into the wooden pews, their collective body heat turning the old stone building into a greenhouse. The scent of hundreds of white lilies, imported, expensive, hand-picked by Trent's overbearing mother, had started to rot under the humidity. It mixed with the sharp, sour tang of nervous sweat and unfiltered pity. Jesse stood perfectly still. His tailored white suit, a silk blend that cost more than a year of his rent, felt heavy. It clung to his shoulders like a straitjacket. He kept his eyes fixed on the heavy oak doors at the back of the nave. They remained firmly shut. Behind him, Trent's best man, Liam, shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Liam's scent, usually a mild, agreeable cedar, was currently spiking with the unmistakable burnt copper stench of panic. "Jesse," Liam whispered, his voice cracking slightly, "I'm going to try calling him again. Maybe there was traffic on the bridge." "Don't," Jesse said. His voice was shockingly steady. He didn't need to look at his phone. He didn't need to hear Liam leave another desperate, echoing voicemail on an unanswering machine. Jesse was an Omega, but he wasn't stupid, and he certainly wasn't naive. You didn't miss your own wedding because of bridge traffic. You missed it because you didn't want to be there. The whispers in the front row began to bleed into the open air. Jesse's aunt leaned over to whisper to his cousin. A harsh hiss of fabric, a muffled sigh. The collective realization was sweeping through the crowd like a slow-moving flood. The Omega has been left at the altar. It was the ultimate humiliation, broadcast live to the city's upper crust. Trent had insisted on a massive wedding. He wanted the press, the society photographers, the grand spectacle to prove he was a family man ready to take over his father's shipping company. Jesse had just wanted Trent. Now, he had neither. A cold, hard knot tightened in Jesse's chest. He refused to cry. Not here. Not in front of these vultures who were already drafting their gossip column texts. He dug his manicured nails into the fleshy part of his palm, using the sharp sting of pain to keep the tears locked securely behind his eyes. Then a sound cut through the murmurs. Clack. The heavy iron latch of the main cathedral doors turned. The grinding noise echoed up into the vaulted ceilings. The whispers died instantly. 200 heads snapped toward the back of the church. Liam let out a loud, shuddering breath of relief. The door swung inward. A gust of damp, freezing wind ripped through the center aisle, catching the white ribbon decorations and tearing them loose. But it wasn't Trent. The man standing in the doorway was tall, his broad shoulders blocking out the gray afternoon light. He wore a charcoal suit that looked darker than black in the shadows, cut with the kind of precision that spoke of dangerous money. A long black overcoat hung open over it, dripping rainwater onto the ancient stone floor. He didn't apologize for the interruption. He simply began to walk down the aisle. With every step he took, the temperature in the cathedral seemed to drop 10 degrees. The air grew heavy, almost difficult to breathe. It wasn't the aggressive, choking dominance of a standard Alpha trying to prove a point. It was something entirely different. It was the crushing weight of absolute, uncontested authority. His scent didn't waft, it struck. Ozone, crushed asphalt, cold iron. The metallic, static charge smell of a violent storm right before the lightning hits. People physically shrank back into their pews as he passed. Some of the older Omegas pressed hands over their mouths. A beta in the third row let out a strangled, terrified gasp. Jesse recognized him. Everyone in the city knew that face, though rarely in person. You only saw Victor Russo in blurry newspaper photographs leaving courthouses or sitting in the VIP boxes of underground fights. He was the head of the Russo syndicate, a man who owned half the politicians in the state and buried the other half. He was ruthless, precise, and completely devoid of the performative mercy that other mob bosses tried to fake. Victor didn't look at the guests. His dark, hard eyes were fixed entirely on Jesse. He stopped at the base of the altar steps. Up close, the angles of his face were sharp enough to cut glass. A faint, white scar cut through the end of his left eyebrow. His eyes were the color of black coffee, unreadable and cold. The priest backed away, clutching his Bible to his chest like a shield. Liam actually whimpered, taking 3 steps backward until he bumped into a floral arrangement. Jesse didn't move. He stood his ground on the elevated marble step, looking down at the Mafia boss. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, but his jaw was set. "You're in the wrong place," Jesse said. The words came out flat, echoing in the dead silent church. Victor looked at him, really looked at him. His gaze dragged from the pristine white lapels of Jesse's suit, up to the tight, angry line of his mouth, and finally to his eyes. "No," Victor said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated in the floorboards. "I'm exactly where I need to be. Trent isn't coming, Jesse." Hearing the words spoken aloud stripped the last layer of deniability away. Jesse flinched, the motion tiny but impossible to hide. "I figured that out," he snapped, his defense mechanism instantly kicking in. Anger was a much better shield than grief. "But unless Trent hired you to be his messenger boy, which I highly doubt, you have no business here. So if you don't mind, I have a wedding to cancel." A faint, almost imperceptible shift happened in Victor's expression. It wasn't a smile, but the hard lines around his mouth eased by a fraction of a millimeter. Amusement. He was amused. Victor took a step up, closing the distance. He was now on the same tier as Jesse. The sheer mass of the man was overwhelming. The smell of cold iron and rain wrapped around Jesse, drowning out the sickening sweet scent of the lilies. "Trent didn't hire me," Victor said, his tone conversational, as if 200 terrified people weren't holding their breath behind them. "Trent owes me. $3 million to be exact. He's been skimming off my ports for 6 months to fund his father's failing shipping routes." A low gasp rippled through the front pews. Trent's mother looked like she was about to faint, slumping against her husband. Jesse stared. "That's a lie. Trent is an idiot, but he's not suicidal. He boarded a private charter to Geneva at 4 o'clock this morning," Victor replied. He reached into his coat pocket. Liam whimpered again, likely expecting a gun, but Victor only pulled out a folded piece of heavy stock paper. He held it out. Jesse didn't want to take it, but his hands moved on their own. He unfolded the paper. It was a flight manifest. Trent's name was printed clearly at the top, alongside a one-way departure stamp dated hours before he was supposed to be putting on his tuxedo. The floor seemed to tilt beneath Jesse's feet. Trent hadn't just gotten cold feet. He had run for his life, and he had let Jesse wake up, get dressed, smile for his mother, and walk down the aisle knowing full well he was already in another time zone. He had used the wedding as a distraction. The perfect cover. While Victor's men were looking for Trent at the church, Trent was vanishing into the clouds. The humiliation burned away, instantly replaced by a searing, white-hot fury. Jesse crumpled the manifest in his fist. He looked up at Victor. "So what? You came here to shoot me in his place? I don't have $3 million, and I clearly don't have a fiancé anymore." "I don't kill civilians," Victor said smoothly, "and I don't care about the $3 million. It's pocket change. What I care about is the insult. The syndicate is watching to see how I handle a rat. If I let Trent's debt slide, I look weak. And in my business, weakness is terminal. Then go to Geneva and find him." I will, eventually, Victor said. But right now I have a different problem. The commission, the older families, they don't like my ascension. They think I'm too volatile, too unattached. They want a traditional boss, a family man. Victor's dark eyes locked onto Jesse's. They want me married. Jesse froze. The breath hitched in his throat. The silence in the cathedral felt heavy, pressing against his eardrums. No, you're out of your mind. It's entirely practical, Victor said, his voice dropping so low that only Jesse could hear the raw gravel in it. You need to salvage your dignity. Walking out of here as an abandoned Omega ruins your reputation in this city. You'll be a joke, a tragedy. But walking out of here on my arm, you become untouchable. You want me to marry a mob boss out of spite? Jesse hissed, his hands shaking. I want you to marry me for survival, Victor corrected. You sign my registry today. You take my name. In exchange, Trent's debt is forgiven. The hit on his head is lifted. And you get absolute financial protection. You live your life. You play the part of a dutiful spouse at my public dinners, and behind closed doors, we stay out of each other's way. Jesse looked over Victor's broad shoulder. He saw the faces of the guests, the whispered judgments. He saw Trent's parents looking at him with a mix of terror and pity. They knew their son had ruined him. If he walked down that aisle alone, the pity would stick to him forever. He would always be the Omega who wasn't enough to make his Alpha stay. But Victor Russo? Victor Russo was power incarnate. And if I say no, Jesse asked, his chin lifting. Victor didn't blink. Then I turn around and walk out the doors. You stand here and explain to these people why you are wearing a white suit alone. And tomorrow, my men begin dismantling Trent's family business brick by brick to recoup my money. Your choice. It wasn't a choice. It was a trap with a velvet lining. Jesse looked at the crushed paper in his hand. Trent had left him to the wolves. Why should he protect Trent's family? Why should he endure the humiliation while Trent drank champagne in Switzerland? Jesse slowly unclenched his fist, letting the crumpled manifest drop to the marble floor. He looked at the priest, who was trembling violently. Do you have a ring? Jesse asked Victor, his voice devoid of emotion. Victor's eyes flared, a brief flash of genuine surprise lighting up the dark irises before he masked it. He didn't speak. He simply reached over to his right hand and pulled a heavy, thick platinum band off his pinky finger. Victor held out his left hand. The palm was rough, calloused, lined with old scars. Jesse didn't hesitate. He reached out and placed his hand in Victor's. The contact was electric, a jolt of raw, grounding warmth that traveled straight up Jesse's arm. Victor's grip was firm, encasing Jesse's trembling fingers in a solid, immovable hold. Victor slid the heavy platinum ring onto Jesse's ring finger. It was too big, loose, and heavy, but it sat there like a manacle. Skip the sermon, Victor told the terrified priest, not looking away from Jesse. Pronounce it. The priest swallowed hard, his voice squeaking. I now pronounce you Alpha and Omega. You may... We're leaving, Victor interrupted. He didn't kiss Jesse. He didn't offer a fake smile. He simply tucked Jesse's hand into the crook of his elbow. Together they turned away from the altar. Jesse kept his spine rigid, his chin held high. He walked down the center aisle, matching Victor's long, predatory strides. The guests scrambled to pull their knees back, pressing themselves flat against the pews to avoid being too close to the mafia boss. No one whispered. No one breathed. They walked out of the cathedral and into the pouring rain, leaving the decaying lilies and the ghost of Jesse's old life behind them. The rain battered against the roof of the armored Maybach like a barrage of pebbles. Inside, the cabin was a fortress of leather, mahogany, and silence. Jesse sat stiffly on the passenger side, staring out the tinted, bulletproof window. The city blurred past in streaks of gray and neon. Now that he was out of the church, away from the staring eyes and the suffocating pressure of the altar, the adrenaline was beginning to crash. His hands began to shake. It started in his fingers, a fine tremor that quickly crawled up his wrists and into his arms. He clamped his hands together in his lap, squeezing his knuckles until they turned white, desperately trying to force his body to be still. The heavy platinum ring on his left hand slid sideways, knocking against his knuckle. It was a freezing, physical reminder of exactly what he had just done. He was married to Victor Russo, a man who likely had bodies buried in the foundations of the city. A heavy crystal tumbler suddenly appeared in his peripheral vision. Jesse jumped slightly, turning his head. Victor was holding out a glass of water, poured from a small carafe in the console. "Drink," Victor said. His voice was quieter in the enclosed space of the car, less of a command and more of an instruction. Jesse took the glass. His fingers brushed against Victor's knuckles. Victor's skin was incredibly warm, a stark contrast to the freezing chill that had settled deep in Jesse's bones. Jesse brought the glass to his lips, his teeth clinking awkwardly against the rim as he forced down a swallow. The water grounded him, soothing his dry throat. "Thank you," Jesse muttered, staring down at the liquid. Victor leaned back into his seat. He took up an unfair amount of space in the car, his broad chest and long legs making the luxurious cabin feel suddenly cramped. But he wasn't crowding Jesse. He deliberately kept his posture relaxed, angled slightly away, pulling his heavy storm-like scent back as much as an alpha could. It was an unexpected courtesy. "The shock will wear off in an hour," Victor said, staring out his own window. "When it does, you'll be angry again. That's fine. Direct it at me if you need to, but don't let the staff see you panic." "The staff," Jesse repeated dully. Right. He wasn't just going to a house. He was going to a compound. "What exactly am I walking into, Victor?" It was the first time Jesse had used his name. Victor's gaze slid over to him, sharp and calculating. "You're walking into my home," Victor said flatly. "Which means it is now your home. It is heavily guarded. You do not leave the perimeter without a security detail. You do not invite anyone from your previous life over without clearing it through my head of security. If you need anything, clothes, food, a distraction, you ask and it is provided." Jesse laughed. It was a short, bitter sound that held no humor. "A gilded cage, a fortified bunker," Victor corrected without missing a beat. "You are my Omega now. That puts a target on your back. There are men in this city who would happily use you to get to me. I won't allow that to happen. My property remains untouched." "My property?" The words bristled against Jesse's pride. He turned his head to glare at the Alpha. "Let's get one thing straight right now," Jesse said, his voice finding its edge again. "I took your deal because the alternative was financial ruin and social humiliation, but I am not your property. I'm not a docile little house spouse you can order around to fetch your slippers. If you wanted a prop to sit quietly in the corner, you should have bought a mannequin." For a long moment, Victor just stared at him. The tension in the car spiked, the air growing thick and heavy. Jesse refused to look away, meeting the Mafia boss's dark, intimidating glare with a fierce scowl of his own. Then Victor's lips twitched. The faint, dangerous smirk returned, transforming his harsh features into something startlingly handsome. "I don't need a ghost, Jesse," Victor said smoothly. "I need someone with enough spine to stand next to a monster and not flinch. Today, you didn't flinch. Keep doing that, and we'll get along fine." The car began to slow, turning off the main avenue and onto a private winding road shrouded by dense, wet pine trees. The tires crunched over gravel before coming to a smooth halt in front of massive, wrought iron gates. Two men in dark raincoats carrying automatic rifles slung over their shoulders stepped out of a guardhouse. They recognized the car instantly, nodding sharply and hitting a button to swing the heavy gates open. The Russo estate wasn't a garish mansion. It was a sprawling, brutalist structure of dark stone, steel, and glass, built into the side of a steep hill overlooking the bay. It looked less like a home and more like a modern fortress. Cold, practical, immovable, much like its owner. The car parked under a wide portico. Before Jesse could even reach for the door handle, a man in a sharp black suit opened it from the outside, holding an umbrella over the opening. "Welcome home, boss," the man said to Victor before looking at Jesse with careful, guarded neutrality. "Sir." Jesse stepped out of the car. The The damp night air immediately clung to his thin silk suit. He shivered, wrapping his arms around his waist. Victor stepped out behind him, shrugging off his heavy black overcoat. Without a word, he draped it over Jesse's shoulders. The coat was massive, swallowing Jesse entirely, but the heavy wool was wonderfully warm. It smelled intensely of Victor, that sharp electric ozone and crushed slate. It was overwhelming, but oddly grounding. Jesse looked up, surprised, but Victor was already walking toward the massive double doors of the house. "Keep up," Victor called over his shoulder. Inside, the house was immaculate. Polished slate floors, dark wood paneling, and minimalist, expensive furniture. But it felt entirely lifeless. There were no photographs, no soft rugs, no personal touches. It looked like a high-end hotel lobby waiting for guests that would never arrive. Victor didn't offer a tour. He led Jesse up a floating glass staircase and down a long, dimly lit hallway on the second floor. He stopped in front of a heavy oak door and pushed it open. "Your room," Victor said. Jesse stepped inside. It was massive. A king-sized bed with dark gray linens, a sitting area, and a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the stormy bay. It was beautiful, but completely sterile. "My room," Jesse echoed. He turned to look at Victor, who remained standing in the doorway. "Not ours?" "I sleep down the hall," Victor said, his expression completely unreadable. "I told you, behind closed doors, we stay out of each other's way. I won't force myself on you, Jesse. The marriage was a business transaction. I expect you to be dressed and downstairs by 8 tomorrow morning. My lawyer will be here to draft the official contracts." Victor didn't wait for a reply. He reached for the brass handle and pulled the door shut, the heavy click of the latch sounding very final in the quiet room. Jesse was left alone. He stood in the center of the vast, quiet bedroom. Slowly, he walked over to the full-length mirror leaning against the far wall. He looked at himself. The tailored white suit was wrinkled and damp at the hem. Victor's massive black overcoat hung off his shoulders. With shaking hands, Jesse reached up and unpinned the crushed, wilting white lily from his lapel. He dropped it into a nearby trash can. Trent was gone. His old life was dead. He was Jesse Russo now, and as he stared into his own tired, resolute eyes in the mirror, he made a silent vow. He was going to survive this, whatever it took. Morning came with the harsh, flat light of a coastal overcast. Jesse woke up staring at a ceiling he didn't recognize. For 10 seconds, his brain offered him the blissful ignorance of sleep inertia. Then, the heavy platinum ring on his left hand snagged the edge of the gray duvet. The memory of the cathedral, the rain, and the cold iron scent of the man down the hall dropped on his chest like an anvil. He didn't cry. The time for that had expired somewhere around midnight. He simply threw off the covers. His wedding suit was ruined, draped over a chair in the corner like a shed skin. In the adjoining closet, he found a row of new clothes. Crisp button-down shirts, tailored slacks, soft cashmere sweaters. They were all in his exact size. They were all in muted, neutral colors, blacks, grays, navy blues. It was a wardrobe designed to blend into the shadows. He chose a plain white shirt and dark trousers. The fabric was unnervingly soft. Expensive. Downstairs, the house was silent. He followed the faint smell of roasted coffee beans and burnt toast to a massive kitchen. It was all stainless steel and black marble, looking more like an industrial operating room than a place to cook. Victor was already there. He sat at the end of a long dining table, wearing a crisp black suit, reading a tablet. Next to him sat an older man in a gray three-piece suit, an open briefcase resting on the table between them. "You're late," Victor said. He didn't look up from the screen. "You didn't give me an alarm clock," Jesse shot back, his voice thick with morning grit. He walked to the coffee maker, found a mug, and poured himself a cup. The espresso was scalding and bitter. It hit his empty stomach like a fist, waking him up the rest of the way. He pulled out a chair directly across from Victor and sat down. The older man cleared his throat. "Good morning. I am Thomas, Mr. Russo's legal counsel. Let's get this over with." Jesse said, wrapping both hands around his warm mug. Thomas slid a thick stack of papers across the dark wood. The pages were dense with legal jargon. This is a standard post-nuptial agreement, heavily modified for your specific circumstances. It dictates the terms of your union. You will receive a monthly stipend of $50,000 for personal expenses. You will have a private driver. In the event of a dissolution of this marriage, provided you have not breached the confidentiality clauses, you will receive a lump sum of $5 million. Jesse stared at the number on the page. It was absurd. It was monopoly money. And my obligations? Jesse asked. You will accompany Mr. Russo to public and private syndicate functions as required, Thomas recited mechanically. You will not speak to the press. You will not maintain contact with anyone from your former life without prior approval. You will not ask questions regarding Mr. Russo's business operations. And you will maintain the absolute appearance of a bonded, devoted partner in all public spaces. Meaning I smile and nod while the mobsters smoke cigars, Jesse translated flatly. Meaning you play the role, Victor corrected. He finally set the tablet face down. His dark eyes met Jesse's. My associates are not fools. They can smell fear. They can smell a lie. If they think you are a hostage, I look vulnerable. If I look vulnerable, people die, usually starting with the perceived weakness. He tapped the table. You. Jesse felt a cold spike of adrenaline. So my life depends on my acting skills. Your life depends on your ability to adapt, Victor said softly. Jesse looked back down at the contract. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a silver pen he had found on the nightstand. He didn't sign it immediately. Instead, he flipped to the third page. I have 2 amendments, Jesse said. Thomas blinked, looking at Victor. Victor simply leaned back, crossing his arms. Let's hear them. First, the monthly stipend. I don't need $50,000 to buy sweaters, but my mother relies on a care facility downtown. Trent was supposed to help cover the costs. I want the payments routed directly to them through a shell company so they don't trace back to you. She can't know where the money comes from. Victor's expression didn't shift. Done. And the second? Trent's family, Jesse said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. His father's shipping company. You said your men were going to dismantle it to recoup your $3 million. They started an hour ago, Victor confirmed coldly. Stop them. Jesse held Victor's gaze. Trent's parents didn't know he was stealing from you. They didn't know he was fleeing. If you bankrupt them, you ruin hundreds of innocent employees. You want me to play the devoted partner? Fine. But I will not sleep in this house knowing my marriage caused a bloodbath. The silence in the kitchen stretched. Thomas looked genuinely terrified, his eyes darting between the Omega and the Mafia boss. You didn't make demands of Victor Russo. You took what he offered, and you thanked him for it. Victor studied Jesse. His scent, usually clamped down tight, flared just a fraction. It was the sharp tang of static electricity, not anger, assessment. You are protecting the family of the man who left you to the wolves, Victor noted. I'm protecting my own conscience, Jesse corrected. I don't give a damn about Trent. Victor stared at him for a long, agonizing minute. Then he reached into his jacket, pulled out a phone, and dialed a single number. He pressed it to his ear. Call the boys off the shipping yards, Victor said into the receiver. Leave the father alone. We'll eat the $3 million. He hung up and tossed the phone onto the table. You have your amendments. Sign the paper. Jesse clicked the pen. He signed his name, his new, legally binding name, on the dotted line. The ink bled slightly into the heavy paper. Good, Victor said, standing up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. Thomas will get you a copy. Rest up today. Tonight, we have a dinner. Who are we having dinner with? Jesse asked. Victor paused in the doorway. He didn't look back. The Wolves. The restaurant was located in the basement of a nondescript building in the financial district. There was no sign on the door. You only walked down those concrete steps if you owned the city, or if you were about to be buried under it. Jesse sat in the back of the Maybach, watching the rain streak the glass. He was wearing a charcoal suit Victor had ordered for him. It was cut sharper than his wedding suit, fitting close to his body, armored in its precision. A thin silver chain hung from his lapel. He looked entirely different. He looked like he belonged to the dark. "Remember the rules," Victor said. He was sitting beside Jesse, a low-ball glass of scotch resting on his knee. "Keep your answers short. Don't volunteer information. And whatever Albert says to you, do not take the bait. He is testing me through you." "Who is Albert?" Jesse asked, pulling his eyes away from the window. "He runs the South Docks. He was my father's right hand. He believes he should be sitting at the head of the table, not me." Victor finished the scotch in one swallow. "He is looking for an excuse to rally the older bosses against me. A hasty secret marriage to an abandoned Omega is exactly the kind of leverage he wants." "Comforting," Jesse muttered. The car stopped. The driver opened the door. As Jesse stepped out onto the wet pavement, Victor appeared right behind him. A heavy, calloused hand pressed into the small of Jesse's back. The touch sent a jolt of heat straight up Jesse's spine. It was a possessive gesture, a territorial marker. Jesse stiffened, but he didn't pull away. They were on stage now. They descended the concrete stairs. Two massive men in heavy coats opened a steel door, bowing their heads slightly as Victor passed. Inside, the air was thick with the suffocating smell of expensive cigars and heavy, aggressive alpha pheromones. Leather booths lined the walls of a low-lit, cavernous room. At the center sat a long mahogany table. 6 men sat around it. They all stopped talking the moment Victor walked in. Every eye turned to Jesse. It was a physical weight, the collective scrutiny of men who ordered executions between courses. Jesse forced his jaw to unclench. He kept his spine straight. He channeled every ounce of the cynical anger that had kept him upright at the altar and wore it like a shield. Victor pulled out a chair for Jesse. Jesse sat down, smoothing his napkin into his lap with steady hands. Victor took the seat at the head of the table, directly to Jesse's left. "Victor," a man at the far end of the table drawled. He was in his 60s, with silver hair slicked back and a thick, scarred neck. He had the suffocating scent of burnt rubber and stale whiskey. "Albert, we were beginning to think the rumors were a joke. But here he is." "Albert," Victor replied, his voice a low, warning rumble. "This is my husband, Jesse." No one offered congratulations. The waiter poured wine. The first course arrived. The conversation shifted to shipping routes, customs officials, and union strikes. It was boring, brutal mathematics. Jesse ate his steak in silence, watching the dynamics of the table. They deferred to Victor, but it was reluctant. The respect was built entirely on fear, and fear was brittle. Halfway through the main course, Albert set his fork down. He leaned heavily on his elbows, staring down the table at Jesse. "So, Jesse," Albert said loudly, cutting through a conversation about port tariffs. "Tell me, how does a man go from marrying the heir of a legitimate shipping company at noon to marrying the head of our syndicate by 3 o'clock?" The table went dead silent. The clinking of silverware stopped. Victor shifted his weight. The smell of cold ozone flared in the room, sharp enough to make the hair on Jesse's arms stand up. Victor was preparing to shut it down. Jesse reached under the table. He pressed his hand flat against Victor's thigh. It was a massive breach of protocol. Victor went completely rigid at the touch, his thigh muscles turning to stone beneath Jesse's palm. But Jesse didn't look at Victor. He looked directly at Albert. "Trent wasn't a legitimate heir," Jesse said. His voice was calm, carrying perfectly across the silent table. "He was a thief who stole from Victor, and a coward who ran when he realized he couldn't cover his tracks. I don't align myself with cowards, Albert." Albert's eyes narrowed. "Is that right? Seems to me you were perfectly happy to marry him right up until he didn't show. Seems to me you just found the biggest, meanest dog in the yard to hide behind when your meal ticket ran away." A few of the other bosses smirked, looking at their plates. Jesse didn't flinch. He picked up his wine glass, taking a slow, measured sip. He set it down gently. If I wanted a meal ticket, I would have taken half of Trent's assets in a civil suit and lived comfortably, Jesse said. He leaned forward slightly, mirroring Albert's aggressive posture. But I prefer a partner who actually owns the ports he claims to operate. A partner who commands a room, rather than barking from the end of the table trying to prove he belongs in it. The temperature in the room plummeted. A younger boss across from Jesse choked on a cough. Albert's face turned a violent shade of purple. The stale whiskey scent spiked with pure, unfiltered rage. He gripped the edge of the table, looking like he was about to launch himself across the mahogany. "You watch your mouth, Omega," Albert snarled. "Albert!" Victor only said the name once. He didn't shout. He didn't raise his voice, but the word carried the lethal, absolute certainty of a loaded gun pressed to the temple. Victor leaned over, placing his hand over Jesse's where it still rested on his thigh. He locked eyes with the older boss. The heavy, suffocating scent of the storm swallowed the room whole, snuffing out Albert's anger with pure, predatory dominance. "You will address my husband with respect," Victor said, the gravel in his voice scraping against the walls. "Or you will not have a jaw left to speak with. Are we clear?" Albert swallowed hard. The purple faded from his face, replaced by a sickly gray. He looked away, staring down at his plate. "Clear, boss." Victor didn't let go of Jesse's hand. He kept his fingers tangled with Jesse's under the table for the rest of the meal. His thumb rubbed slowly, rhythmically against Jesse's knuckles. It wasn't an act for the bosses. They couldn't see it. It was real, and it was terrifying. The ride back to the estate was silent. It wasn't the tense, calculating silence of the morning. It was a heavy, exhausted quiet. The adrenaline that had kept Jesse sharp and biting at the restaurant was rapidly evaporating. His hands were shaking again. He kept them buried in the pockets of his slacks, staring out the window at the blurred city lights. He had just insulted a mafia boss to his face. He had stepped into a pit of vipers and deliberately kicked one. It was stupid. It was reckless. But he hadn't wanted to sit there and let Albert disrespect Victor, which was even more stupid. They walked into the quiet, dim foyer of the estate. The security detail melted away into the shadows outside. Victor stripped off his suit jacket, tossing it over the back of a leather armchair. He loosened his silk tie, pulling it completely free and unbuttoning the top two buttons of his collar. Without the armor of the suit, he looked less like a syndicate boss and more like a deeply tired man. He walked into the kitchen. Jesse followed him, hovering near the island counter. Victor pulled two heavy crystal glasses from a cabinet. He poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into each and slid one across the marble to Jesse. "Drink," Victor said. Jesse picked it up. It wasn't scotch this time. It was bourbon, smooth, heavy, burning all the way down his throat. He coughed slightly, setting the glass down. Victor leaned against the counter, resting his forearms on the marble. He was looking at Jesse intently. The cold, unreadable mask he wore in public had slipped. His dark eyes were searching, tracing the line of Jesse's jaw, the tension in his shoulders. "You shouldn't have provoked Albert," Victor said quietly. "He was trying to humiliate you," Jesse shot back, defensive instantly. "He was using me to make you look like a fool. I shut him down. You put a target on your own back. Albert is petty. He doesn't handle being embarrassed, especially by an Omega. He will hold that grudge." "Then let him," Jesse snapped. He gripped the edge of the marble counter, his knuckles turning white. "I'm not going to sit quietly and let a group of thugs talk down to me. I spent 3 years letting Trent dictate how I spoke, how I dressed, who I insulted. I am done making myself small so insecure alphas can feel tall." He was breathing hard, the suppressed rage of the past 24 hours bubbling over. He expected Victor to snap back. He expected the crushing, dominant scent of the storm to force him into submission. Instead, Victor just watched him. The scent of ozone shifted, mellowing into something deeper. Wet earth, warm rain. It was disarming. "I didn't expect you to make yourself small," Victor said, his voice a low, rough murmur in the quiet kitchen. I expected you to be terrified. I am terrified, Jesse blurted out. The truth slipped past his teeth before he could stop it. He hated the sound of it in the air. It sounded weak. He dropped his gaze to the dark marble, staring at the reflection of the overhead lights. A heavy silence stretched between them. Then, Jesse heard the soft shuffle of footsteps. Victor moved around the kitchen island. He stopped right in front of Jesse. The sheer physical presence of the man forced Jesse to look up. Victor was so close that Jesse could see the faint silver lines of old scars on his neck, right where the collar of his shirt fell open. Victor reached out. Jesse flinched, bracing himself, but the touch was incredibly gentle. Victor's rough fingers brushed against the side of Jesse's neck, his thumb resting lightly just below Jesse's jaw. It was right over a pulse point, a deeply vulnerable, intimate place. I know you are, Victor said softly. His thumb stroked the skin once, a grounding, steadying pressure. You were thrown to the wolves. But you didn't run, Jesse. You stared the wolf in the eyes, and you bared your teeth. Do you have any idea how rare that is? Jesse's breath caught in his throat. The heat from Victor's hand was radiating through his entire body. His heart was hammering against his ribs, fast and erratic. It wasn't fear anymore. It was something entirely different. He looked up into Victor's eyes. The cold black coffee color was gone. They were dark, intense, burning with a quiet intensity that made the air in the kitchen feel suddenly very thin. You defended me today, Victor said. The words were heavy, carrying a weight that Jesse didn't fully understand yet. It's in the contract, Jesse whispered, his voice trembling slightly, maintaining the appearance of a bonded partner. Victor's thumb stopped moving. A faint, bitter smile touched the corner of his mouth. He let his hand drop away from Jesse's neck. The sudden absence of his touch left the skin there feeling cold. Right, Victor said, stepping back. The distance between them instantly felt like a mile. The contract. It was a good performance, Jesse. Get some sleep. Victor turned and walked out of the kitchen, his heavy footsteps echoing up the glass staircase. Jesse stood alone in the dark kitchen. He reached up, his fingers brushing against the spot on his neck where Victor had touched him. His pulse was still racing. The performance had been perfect. But as Jesse stared at the empty doorway, he realized with a sinking dread that the line between acting and reality was already starting to blur. Autumn bled into winter, turning the bay outside the estate's massive windows from a turbulent gray to a frozen, unforgiving black. 6 weeks had passed since the wedding. The daily rhythm of the fortified house had settled into a strange, quiet domesticity. Jesse woke at 7. He drank the bitter espresso. He sat across from Victor in the stark kitchen while the Alpha read his tablet and made muted, deadly phone calls. They moved around each other like two planets locked in orbit, close enough to feel the gravity, but terrified of the collision. The contract dictated their public lives. 3 times a week they attended dinners, charity galas, and underground fights. Jesse wore the tailored suits. He stood by Victor's side. He learned to control his scent, burying his anxiety under a layer of crisp, neutral calm. The city's underworld watched them like hawks, waiting for the cracks to show. No cracks showed. Jesse was a fortress. But behind closed doors, the silence was deafening. Victor was careful. Too careful. He kept a deliberate, frustrating distance, never crossing the boundary he had drawn that first night in the kitchen. He provided everything. He asked for nothing. It was maddening. Tuesday afternoon brought the first real break in the routine. Jesse was sitting in the library, staring blankly at a leather-bound book, when the heavy oak doors opened. Victor walked in. He wasn't wearing his usual suit. He wore dark jeans, heavy boots, and a thick black sweater. It made him look less like a CEO and more like a soldier. "Get your coat," Victor said. Jesse closed the book. "Where are we going? Thomas didn't put anything on the schedule. Not everything goes on the schedule. We have a drive." 10 minutes later, they were in the back of a black SUV. Not the Maybach. An armored, unmarked vehicle with heavily tinted windows. Bennett, Victor's massive head of security, was driving. They didn't head toward the financial district or the shipping yards. They headed north toward the quiet, affluent suburbs. Jesse watched the familiar streets roll by, his heart kicking against his ribs. He knew this route. The SUV pulled through the wrought iron gates of the Oakwood Care Center. It was a high-end facility, manicured lawns, quiet walking paths, state-of-the-art medical staff. It was where Jesse's mother had lived for the last 4 years since her stroke. Jesse turned to Victor, his eyes wide. "What is this?" "Your mother thinks you're on an extended honeymoon," Victor said, his voice level, his eyes focused on the front gates. "Thomas arranged the cover story with the administration. The shell company has been paying the bills, as agreed. But 6 weeks is a long time for a son to go without visiting. People will start to talk. The nurses will gossip. It becomes a liability." "So this is a security measure," Jesse said. His chest tightened. He told himself it was just the contract. It was always just the contract. "Yes," Victor said. But he didn't look at Jesse. They walked into the bright, sterile lobby. The receptionist, an older beta woman, beamed when she saw Jesse. She ushered them toward the east wing. Jesse's mother was sitting in a wheelchair by the window of her private room, a crocheted blanket draped over her lap. She looked smaller than Jesse remembered, more fragile. Her mind was sharp, but her body was failing. "Jesse!" she gasped, her face lighting up. Jesse crossed the room in 3 strides, dropping to his knees beside her chair. He wrapped his arms around her frail shoulders, breathing in the familiar, comforting scent of lavender and old paper. For the first time in 6 weeks, the rigid armor around his heart cracked. A ragged breath hitched in his throat. "Mom, I missed you." "Look at you," she murmured, her weak hand coming up to cup his cheek. "You look so handsome. And so thin. Did you enjoy the trip?" "It was eventful," Jesse managed to say, forcing a smile. He heard heavy footsteps stop at the foot of the bed. Jesse looked back. Victor stood there, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. The crushing, dominant scent of ozone and iron was completely gone. Victor had clamped it down so tightly that he smelled like nothing at all. "Mom," Jesse said, his voice trembling slightly. He stood up. "This is Victor." His mother looked past Jesse. She studied the giant of a man standing in her room. She didn't know about the syndicate. She didn't know about the blood, the guns, the extortion. She only knew what Jesse had told her over the phone, that things with Trent had ended abruptly and he had met someone else, someone serious. "Victor," she said, her voice thin but firm. "Come here." Victor stepped forward. He moved with a strange, careful hesitation, as if afraid he might break the floorboards. He stopped beside Jesse. "Mrs. Hayes," Victor said respectfully. She reached out. Victor, to Jesse's absolute shock, gently took her frail, wrinkled hand in his massive, scarred one. "He doesn't look like much of a talker," she told Jesse, a faint spark of humor in her eyes. Then she looked back at Victor. "My son has a habit of carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He tries to take care of everyone else and forgets himself. Trent never understood that. Do you understand that, Victor?" Victor looked down at the old woman. The mask was gone. His expression was painfully open, stripped of the syndicate boss persona. "I do, ma'am," Victor said, his voice a low, rough rumble. "I understand exactly what he carries. I won't let him carry it alone anymore." Jesse stared at him. The words weren't a performance. They were spoken with a quiet, lethal sincerity. "Good," she patted his hand. "Then welcome to the family. Now both of you sit down. Tell me about the honeymoon." They stayed for an hour. Victor didn't pace. He didn't check his phone. He sat in a stiff plastic chair and answered her questions with a polite, measured calmness. He lied flawlessly about a villa in Tuscany, detailing the food and the weather with surprising accuracy. Jesse just watched him, the heavy platinum ring on his finger suddenly feeling less like a manacle and more like an anchor. When they finally walked back out to the SUV, The winter air bit at Jesse's cheeks. He stopped before getting in. "Thank you," Jesse said quietly. Victor paused by the door. "It was necessary." "Stop hiding behind the contract, Victor." Jesse stepped closer. The cold air made a mist of his breath. "You didn't have to talk to her. You didn't have to hold her hand. You did." Victor looked down at him. The scent of ozone flared, dark and restless. He reached out, his knuckles brushing the lapel of Jesse's coat. It was a fleeting, agonizingly brief touch. "Get in the car, Jesse. We have a dinner tonight. The West Side bosses." The moment shattered. Victor turned away, sliding into the back seat. Jesse stood frozen for a second, frustration burning hot in his chest. He was tired of the lines. He was tired of the distance. But as he climbed into the car, he realized one terrifying truth. He didn't want the contract anymore. He wanted the man. The restaurant was supposed to be neutral ground. It was a high-end steakhouse in the theater district, bought out for the night by the West Side capos. The air inside was thick with the smell of roasting meat, red wine, and a heavy, suffocating blanket of alpha posturing. Jesse sat at Victor's right hand. The dinner had been agonizingly tense. Albert was not there, but his presence was felt. The other bosses were asking pointed, probing questions about the South Docks, Albert's territory. They were sniffing for blood in the water. They wanted to know if Victor was going to put the old dog down, or if the old dog was going to take the yard. "The docks are running efficiently," Victor said smoothly, cutting his steak. "There's no internal conflict. Albert knows his place." "Does he?" A capo named Carmine sneered. "Because word on the street is Albert's been buying up untraceable hardware. Doesn't sound like a man looking to retire." Victor didn't miss a beat. Men buy hardware when they are afraid. Let him waste his money. They finished dessert in a tense, strained silence. Victor stood up, buttoning his jacket. The signal was clear. The king was leaving. Bennett and 3 other guards formed a tight perimeter as Victor and Jesse walked out the back exit, heading toward the private alley where the vehicles were waiting. The alley was dark, smelling of wet garbage and cold asphalt. "Something is wrong," Bennett muttered, his hand dropping to the inside of his coat. The alley was entirely empty. The armored Maybach was missing. "Back inside!" Victor barked, his arm shooting out to shove Jesse behind him. The first gunshot was deafening. It echoed off the brick walls like a cannon blast. The glass door of the restaurant shattered into a million glittering teeth. One of Victor's guards dropped instantly, a dark stain blooming on his chest. "Go!" Victor roared. Chaos erupted. Gunfire tore through the narrow alley from the rooftops. Sparks flew as bullets chewed into the brickwork and the dumpsters. Victor grabbed Jesse by the collar of his coat, violently yanking him down behind a massive, rusted industrial dumpster. Bennett returned fire, the sharp cracks of his pistol deafening in the confined space. Jesse slammed into the freezing, wet pavement. His ears were ringing. He couldn't breathe. The acrid smell of gunpowder and blood hit the back of his throat, gagging him. He scrambled backward, pressing his spine against the cold metal of the dumpster. "Stay down!" Victor yelled, drawing a heavy black pistol from his waistband. "Who is it?" Jesse shouted over the gunfire. "Albert!" Victor snarled, racking the slide. The bastard actually made a play. A bullet ricocheted off the rim of the dumpster, showering them in sparks. Victor leaned out, firing 3 rapid shots into the darkness. A heavy thud sounded from a fire escape above. They were pinned. There were at least 6 shooters, elevated, with automatic weapons. Bennett was bleeding from his shoulder, still firing methodically. "We can't stay here," Bennett shouted. "They're going to flank the alley." "The loading dock at the end of the block," Victor ordered. "There's a reinforced steel door. On my count." Victor turned to Jesse. His face was entirely different. The calm, calculated CEO was gone. This was the monster. This was the man who had clawed his way to the top of the city's bloodiest food chain. His eyes were wide, feral, and pitch black. "When I say go, you run." Victor grabbed Jesse's face with his free hand. His grip was bruising, desperate. You do not look back. You do not stop. You get behind that steel door. I'm not leaving you, Jesse choked out, panic finally clawing up his throat. You do as I say, Victor roared, the command carrying the full, crushing weight of his alpha scent. It hit Jesse like a physical blow, forcing the air from his lungs. Run! Victor stood up. He didn't crouch. He stepped out from behind the cover of the dumpster, making himself a massive, impossible-to-miss target, and opened fire on the fire escapes. Go! Bennett shoved Jesse forward. Jesse ran. He slipped on the wet asphalt, his expensive shoes finding zero traction, but he scrambled forward. The noise was unbearable. Concrete chipped and exploded around his feet. He could hear Victor shouting, drawing the fire away from him. Jesse reached the loading dock. He threw his weight against the heavy steel door. It was unlocked. He tumbled inside, crashing onto the concrete floor of a dark, abandoned warehouse. He scrambled back to his feet, turning to the open door. Bennett came through first, clutching his bleeding shoulder. Victor! Jesse screamed. Victor was backing away down the alley, still firing. He was 10 yards away. 5. Then, a shooter stepped out from behind a concrete pylon at ground level. Jesse saw the flash of the muzzle before he heard the shot. Victor jerked violently, his body twisted, his momentum stopping dead. He stumbled, falling heavily against the brick wall. No! Jesse's voice tore out of his throat, raw and ragged. He didn't think. The instinct to survive, to hide, vanished. He bolted back out the door into the alley. Jesse, no! Bennett yelled, but Jesse was already moving. Victor was on one knee clutching his side. His gun was empty. The shooter was raising his weapon to finish it. Jesse didn't have a weapon. He didn't have armor. He had pure, unadulterated adrenaline. He lunged forward, grabbing a heavy, discarded metal pipe from a pile of construction debris near the door. He swung it with everything he had. The pipe connected with the shooter's wrist with a sickening crunch. The man screamed, dropping the gun. Jesse didn't stop. He swung again, catching the man across the jaw, sending him crashing to the pavement. Jesse dropped the pipe. He grabbed Victor's heavy overcoat. Get up! Victor, get up! Victor looked at him, his dark eyes wide with shock. Blood was pouring from his side, staining his crisp white shirt a violent, terrifying crimson. With a guttural groan, Victor forced himself up. Jesse threw his shoulder under Victor's arm, bearing half of the massive Alpha's weight. Together, they stumbled the last 5 yards into the warehouse. Bennett slammed the heavy steel door shut and threw the massive iron deadbolt. The gunfire outside immediately sounded muffled, distant. Victor collapsed onto the concrete floor. He was breathing heavily, his face pale. Let me see. Jesse dropped to his knees, his hands frantically tearing at Victor's coat. He ripped the shirt open. The bullet had entered his left side, just below the ribs. It was bleeding badly, but there was no exit wound. You idiot! Victor gasped, his head falling back against the concrete wall. I told you to run. Shut up, Jesse snapped, stripping off his own suit jacket and pressing it violently against the wound. You don't get to die to prove a point to the commission. Put pressure on this. Do it! Victor's hand clamped over Jesse's, pressing down on the makeshift bandage. His skin was cold. The scent of ozone was fading, replaced by the terrifying copper tang of blood. Bennett was on his radio, calling for the extraction team. They're 2 minutes out, heavily armed. Hold tight. Jesse sat on the freezing concrete, his hands covered in Victor's blood, keeping the pressure steady. He was shaking uncontrollably. Tears were finally falling, hot and furious, tracking through the dirt on his face. Victor turned his head, looking at Jesse. Even bleeding out on a warehouse floor, his eyes were sharp. You came back, Victor whispered, his voice failing. I told you. Jesse choked on a sob, leaning down until their foreheads almost touched. I don't align myself with cowards, and I don't leave my husband behind. Victor's bloody hand slid up, catching the back of Jesse's neck. He pulled him down, pressing a hard, desperate kiss to the side of Jesse's head. It was a promise. "I've got you," Victor breathed into his hair. "I've got you," Jesse echoed, holding on for dear life. The underground medical wing smelled violently of bleach and iron. Jesse sat in a rigid plastic chair, swimming in an oversized gray t-shirt Bennett had dug out of an emergency locker. His own ruined, blood-soaked suit was sealed in a biohazard bin by the door. He kept his eyes locked on the steady rise and fall of Victor's heavily bandaged chest. The heavy steel door clicked and hissed open. Bennett stepped inside. He wore a canvas sling over his left arm, and his face was entirely gray with exhaustion. "Carmine put a bullet in Albert's head outside the South Docks," Bennett said, his voice a flat mechanical hum. "The rest of the commission is falling in line. The war's over." Jesse nodded once. He didn't care about the syndicate politics. He cared about the dried blood he still couldn't manage to scrub out from under his fingernails. Bennett lingered near the door. He looked at Jesse, the security chief's usual stoic wall cracked by a quiet, heavy respect. "He gave you a direct Alpha command to run. Nobody disobeys him." "You did." "He's an idiot," Jesse muttered, staring at the floor. Bennett offered a faint, grim smirk. He turned and left the room. Silence settled back over the clinic, broken only by the rhythmic, piercing chirp of the heart monitor. Jesse rested his elbows on his knees, burying his face in his hands. The adrenaline crash hit him like a freight train. He was shaking, a deep, bone-rattling tremor he couldn't stop. "Stop crying!" The voice was a jagged, barely there rasp. Jesse's head snapped up. Victor's dark eyes were open. The mob boss looked terrible, pale, bruised, hooked to a maze of IV lines, but he was awake. "I'm not crying," Jesse said, swiping a rough hand across his face. "The bleach in here is blinding." "You're a terrible liar," Victor breathed. He shifted on the narrow mattress, a sharp hiss of pain escaping his teeth as the stitches pulled. He reached out his right hand, leaving it resting palm up on the sheets. Jesse stood, crossing the short distance, and placed his hand in Victor's. The Alpha's grip was incredibly weak, but the heat of his skin was an instant anchor. "Albert is dead," Jesse told him quietly. "I heard." Victor's thumb brushed over Jesse's bruised, scraped knuckles. "Thomas is drafting a new contract tomorrow morning." Jesse stiffened. The cold, transactional reality of their arrangement rushed back into the room. "We had a deal, Victor. I played my part. You don't need to rewrite the terms just because I swung a pipe in an alley." "The deal is dead," Victor said. His voice lost the gravelly weakness, turning deadly, terrifyingly serious. "I told you this marriage was a business transaction. I lied." Jesse froze. "What?" "I was at the church before Trent left," Victor confessed, his dark gaze burning through the haze of the morphine. "I watched you fix his tie in the vestibule. I hated him for it. The debt was an excuse. The contract was a cage to keep you in my house without making you feel like a hostage. But I'm done with the contract, Jesse." Victor tugged weakly, pulling Jesse an inch closer. "I don't want a business partner. I don't want you sleeping down the hall." Jesse stared at the man who commanded a ruthless, bloody syndicate, the monster who had stepped in front of a firing squad without a second thought. He reached out, his thumb gently tracing the familiar scar on Victor's brow. "You're an arrogant bastard," Jesse whispered. "I am," Victor agreed easily. Jesse leaned down and kissed him. It was a messy, desperate collision, tasting entirely of copper and antiseptic. But underneath the blood and the sharp bite of survival, it felt exactly like home. If this Mafia romance had you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button right now. Share this video with your friends who need a little dark, gritty BL drama in their lives, and hit subscribe so you never miss another epic story. Drop a comment below. Would you have stayed with Victor in the alley? See you next time.